Okay. Picking back up. Yeah, this was an interesting paragraph. He said, in all earnestness, I asked myself what kind of world I had stumbled into. I feel like a lot of people have this feeling, specifically in relation to discovering the work of Carl Gustav Jung and really what it implies about the state of our modern psyche, to the extent that a whole part of it, specifically the unconscious or a unconscious, the collective unconscious, has been cut out of modern science as a study of science. The ability to understand and to quantify and to qualify using qualitative analysis or quantitative analysis the effects of not just consciousness, not just a psychology of consciousness, but a psychology of the psyche itself, not just the top of that iceberg, but what lies beneath. And in this context, we're saying, okay, world stumbled into plainly the urban world, knew of nothing about the country world, the real world of mountains. Plainly the urban world knew nothing of the real world of animal and God's thoughts. So this is interesting that he decided to reference God's thoughts as plants and crystals. That gets deep into the esoteric culture commentary community, where we think about, like, what did it mean when God's thoughts were made manifest? Oh, well, see, it's hard to preface it, because I'm thinking in terms of time and space. I'm thinking in terms of a phylogenetic destination, maybe in terms of a final cause argument, maybe in terms of it just transpiring, the material mineral kingdom being codified in terms of early celestial formation, and then water being concretized and assimilated, and then life springing forth not before crystals. And the mineral kingdom has its own interaction with psyche, as seen in alchemical studies. And the plants being the emanations of that striving to use energy, specifically from the sun, in order to reproduce, in order to colonize, in order to move places. So I'm just saying that this was an interesting sentence for me. Moving forward, I found this explanation self-comforting. At all levels, it bolstered my self-esteem. What decided this young scholar of philosophical bent to enter medicine has not, as far as I know, been told. It was possibly the imposing motto of his very distinguished grandfather of Humboldt's time. But he has himself described the strange events that turned him in the last months of his medical schooling from medicine and surgery to psychiatry. While following his recorded courses, he had been avid... Okay, so yeah, this is... I don't know how much I'm gonna... I don't know how much I want to go into this, because this is really cool, like, to give a overview and a background of Jung's thought. But it really is only when we're ready to get into the nitty-gritties of, like, oh, who was Jung and how is Jung's self, how to relate to that in terms of his historiography. Okay, he'd been avidly reading on Sundays in Kant and Goethe, Hermann, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, but again had found when he thought to talk of such authors to his friends that no one wanted to hear of them. All his friends wanted were facts, and all he had for them was talk, until one day there came to him someone as solid and cold as steel. He was in his room studying, with the door half open to the dining room, where his widowed mother was knitting by the window, when a loud report sounded like a pistol shot, and the circular walnut table beside her had split from the rim to beyond the center, a table of solid walnut, dried and seasoned for some 70 years. 2 weeks later, the young medical student, returning home at evening, found his mother, his 14-year-old sister, and the maid in high agitation. About an hour earlier, another deafening creak had come from... So this is like introduction to maybe some spooky personal events that happened in Jung's life that led him to believe in something outside of the normally conditioned status quo of how we think about causality. So that's going into that. They said to the end of his life... Wait, nearby cupboard, Jung discovered a bread knife broken into pieces, one in the corner of the basket, handle each of the passes. Okay, a few weeks later, he learned of certain relatives engaged in table turning who had a medium, a young girl of 15 and a half who produced somnambulistic states and spiritualistic phenomena. So this is really important to me because this is how I kind of got into Jung. Not literally, I got into Jung based on psychological types, but I've always been drawn to esoteric culture commentary, including somnambulistic states and spiritualistic phenomenon. Leave a comment if you have a similar leaning. So he was studying and reading books, and then he realized, like, damn, nobody's really talking about what's going on behind the curtain. What's going on there? Come on now. And then he was like, what? Certain relatives engaged in table turning? Had a medium? Oh, let's investigate. So invited to participate, Jung immediately conjectured that the manifestations in his mother's house might be connected with that medium. He joined the session. What? It's like, nah. He joined the sessions and for the next 2 years meticulously took notes until in the end the medium, feeling her powers failing, began to cheat and Jung departed. So this is doubling back to volume 1. Somnambulistic mediums. And where we get that prime distinction between, okay, so how can we discuss this from a psychological perspective and leave this within the realm of psychology as opposed to any other discipline of science being formulated in terms of a literary analysis, a philosophical analysis, specifically a psychological analysis. Meanwhile, he was still at medical school, and in season the time arrived for the state examination. His professor in psychology had been not exactly in his judgment stimulating. Moreover, in the medical world of that time, psychiatry was held in contempt. So preparing himself, he had reserved for the last his psychiatric textbook, which he opened with the unpromising thought, well, now let's see what a psychiatrist has to say for himself. Yeah, that's important because we tend not to do that in this modern era. Like, what do these people actually have to say for themselves? Now, in this way, we're juxtaposing it because we're preamping it up to give you a like a reference frame to say, okay, well, what are we talking about? We're talking about on volume 6. So what does this have to do with psychological types? In order to understand psychological types, we're going to have to go through the Portable Jung and quite possibly the question of psychological types. And that's a hard road to go through before we even get to volume 6, as we crest through the psychology of individuation. So beginning with the preface, he read, "It is probably due to the peculiarity of the subject and its incomplete state of development that psychiatric textbooks are stamped with a more or less subjective character." Oh, shoot. Okay, dang, this is crucial. Beginning with the preface, he read, "It is probably due to the peculiarity of the subject and its incomplete state of development that psychiatric textbooks are stamped with a more or less subjective character." Yo, that's heavy. And I guess people not even gonna realize what that even means. It's probably due to the peculiarity of the subject. What subject? Psychiatry. Or the subject of the individual. It's probably due to the peculiarity of the subject and its incomplete state of development that psychiatric textbooks are stamped with a more or less subjective character. A few lines further on, Kraft Ebing termed psychoses diseases of the personality, and the reader's heart began suddenly to pound. Diseases of the personality. And the reader's heart began suddenly to pound. He had to stand and draw a deep breath. His excitement was intense, for as he tells, it had become clear to me in a flash of illumination that for me the only possible goal was psychiatry. The only possible goal was psychiatry. Here and here alone was the empirical field common to spiritual and biological facts. The empirical field common to spiritual and biological facts. That's really crucial. Why? Why would psychiatry be the only place where there's an empirical field common to spiritual and biological facts? Leave a comment if you understand what I just said. We probably should go forth and explain it. But we're going to have to get deeper into Jung's work to really flesh out, okay, well, psychiatry. What about psychiatry allowed an empirical field common to spiritual and biological facts? When we pick up, we're going to dive into number 2, the scholar, physician.